The morning air at Woodridge Elementary carried the scent of fresh chalk and children's laughter, but within minutes, that innocent atmosphere would shatter like glass against concrete. Officer Kane adjusted his uniform as he walked through the cheerful hallways, his retired K-9 partner Ranger padding silently beside him, their footsteps echoing against colorful murals painted by tiny hands. This was supposed to be a routine career day demonstration, nothing more than showing eager second graders how police dogs work, how they protect communities, how they save lives. Kane had done this presentation dozens of times before, watching children's eyes light up as Ranger performed his training exercises, their giggles filling the air when the German Shepherd would sit perfectly on command or demonstrate his tracking abilities. But today would be different. Today, Ranger would detect something far more sinister than hidden contraband or escaped suspects. As they approached room 112, Kane noticed his partner's demeanor shift subtly, the dog's ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring slightly as he processed scents floating through the corridor. Miss Clara Langston stood at her classroom door, red cardigan perfectly pressed, warm smile radiating the kind of maternal energy that made parents feel their children were safe, protected, loved. Her classroom sparkled with motivational posters declaring, "Kindness is contagious," and hand-cut paper stars that caught the morning. Sunlight streaming through windows. Everything appeared exactly as it should in this sanctuary of learning, this place where innocence was supposed to flourish under careful guidance. Kane pushed open the door, expecting nothing more than 22 excited faces turning toward them with wonder. Instead, the moment Ranger's paws crossed the threshold, the atmosphere became electric with tension. The dog froze mid-step, every muscle in his powerful frame going rigid as his training kicked into overdrive. His nose twitched frantically, processing information that his human partner couldn't detect, couldn't understand, couldn't even imagine. Then came the sound that would haunt everyone present for years to come, a bark that would expose evil hiding behind the sweetest smile. Ranger's bark erupted through the classroom like a gunshot, sharp and aggressive, cutting through the children's excited chatter with surgical precision. This wasn't the playful bark of a dog seeking attention or the startled yelp of an animal caught off guard. This was something primal, urgent, dangerous. The German Shepherd's lips pulled back, revealing teeth that gleamed white against his dark gums, his entire body coiled like a spring ready to explode into action. His eyes locked onto Miss Langston with laser-like intensity, and he took 2 deliberate steps forward, hackles rising along his spine like a mountain range of warning. The children gasped, their innocent faces twisting with confusion and fear as their beloved teacher backed away from the snarling animal, her hands raised in what appeared to be surrender. Kane felt his blood turn to ice as he watched his partner's reaction, because in 7 years of working together, through drug busts and dangerous arrests, through search and rescue operations and crowd control situations, Ranger had never ever displayed this level of aggression toward a civilian. The dog's growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself, and when Kane tugged gently on the leash, Ranger resisted for the first time in their partnership, his paws planted firmly on the linoleum, as if he were guarding something precious from immediate threat. Miss Langston's smile flickered like a dying light bulb, her voice trembling, as she suggested they step outside to avoid frightening the children further, but Ranger's response was another explosive bark that made several students cry out in alarm. In the back row, little Lucy. Parker sat frozen in her chair, her brown eyes wide with terror as she clutched her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles turned white, and Kane noticed something that made his stomach drop like a stone into dark water. The child wasn't looking at the dog with fear. She was looking at Miss Langston with recognition, the kind of recognition that speaks of secrets too heavy for 7-year-old shoulders to carry, and in that moment, Kane realized his partner had just detected something that would change everything they thought they knew about safety. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. In the world of law enforcement, there exists an unspoken truth that every veteran officer carries like a scar across their soul. Evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare or warning signs. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a weapon that gleams in the sunlight. Instead, it wraps itself in the most trusted disguises, hiding behind warm smiles, gentle voices, and positions of authority that grant access to our most precious possessions, our children. This is the story of how a retired police dog named Ranger became the unlikely hero who exposed a trafficking network that had been operating in plain sight, using America's schools as hunting grounds for predators who understood that the best place to hide darkness is within institutions designed to nurture light. Woodridge Elementary School embodied everything parents dream of when they envision their child's educational experience. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood where white picket fences lined tree-shaded streets and children rode bicycles without fear, the school stood as a beacon of safety and learning. Its red brick facade was adorned with colorful banners celebrating student achievements, while manicured gardens bloomed with flowers planted by eager young hands during science projects. Inside, hallways buzzed with the energy of discovery, walls lined with artwork that spoke of imagination unleashed and dreams taking flight. The PTA meetings were well-attended affairs where parents discussed fundraisers and field trips over homemade cookies, their biggest concerns revolving around whether the playground equipment needed updating or if the lunch menu offered enough healthy options. Faculty members were beloved fixtures in the community, many having taught multiple generations of the same families, their dedication to education matched only by their genuine affection for the children in their care. It was the kind of place where doors remained unlocked during school hours because everyone knew everyone, where teachers stayed late to help struggling students, and where the principal remembered every child's name. But beneath this veneer of perfection, a predator had been carefully constructing her web, using the trust of an entire community as camouflage for activities so heinous that when finally exposed, they would shake the foundation of everything parents believed about institutional safety. The woman known as Miss Clara Langston had arrived the previous fall with impeccable credentials, glowing recommendations, and the kind of warmth that made children gravitate toward her like flowers turning toward the sun. Her classroom had become a sanctuary where struggling readers found confidence, where shy children discovered their voices, and where parents felt blessed that their sons and daughters had been placed under such caring guidance. She stayed after hours to help with homework, organized special projects that made learning come alive, and had even volunteered to coordinate the spring fundraiser that would benefit the school's arts program. What nobody realized was that this dedication masked a calculated strategy, each act of kindness serving as reconnaissance, each moment of trust building the foundation for something unspeakably dark. Officer Kane had worked with his canine partner, Ranger, for 7 years, during which time they had developed the kind of bond that transcends the typical relationship between handler and animal. Ranger wasn't just a tool in Kane's law enforcement arsenal. He was family, a four-legged guardian angel who had saved lives, solved cases, and demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to detect danger that human senses couldn't perceive. The German Shepherd possessed training that had cost thousands of dollars and countless hours to perfect, his nose capable of detecting drugs, explosives, and human sense with precision that bordered on the miraculous. But more than his technical skills, Ranger possessed something that couldn't be trained, an instinct for evil that seemed to operate on a frequency beyond human comprehension. In their years together, Kane had learned to trust his partner's judgment implicitly, understanding that when Ranger signaled danger, lives were often hanging in the balance. They had worked high-profile cases, tracked escaped convicts through dense forests, and provided security for events where thousands of people gathered, but nothing in their extensive experience would prepare them for what they were about to uncover in a second-grade classroom filled with construction paper hearts and alphabet charts. The autumn morning arrived crisp and golden, painting Woodridge Elementary in hues that made the building look like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Officer Kane loaded his gear into the patrol car while Ranger stretched in the backyard, the German Shepherd's muscles rippling beneath his dark coat as he prepared for what both assumed would be a routine community outreach event. Kane had received the invitation 3 weeks prior from Principal Atkins, who explained that Career Day had become one of the school's most anticipated events, with parents taking time off work to watch their children's faces light up as they learned about different professions. The police department's K9 demonstration was always a crowd favorite, combining education with entertainment as children watched in amazement, while Ranger displayed his incredible abilities. Kane packed the usual props, tennis balls for scent tracking, a dummy suspect sleeve for bite work demonstrations, and treats to reward Ranger's performance. He had delivered this presentation so many times he could recite it from memory, explaining how police dogs are trained, how they assist officers in dangerous situations, and how their keen senses make them invaluable partners in law enforcement. The drive to Woodridge took them through neighborhoods where Halloween decorations were beginning to appear on front porches, jack-o'-lanterns grinning from doorsteps, while fake spiderwebs adorned mailboxes. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, his brown eyes scanning the passing scenery with professional interest, occasionally tilting his head when a particularly interesting scent wafted through the partially open window. Upon arrival, Kane was greeted by Principal Atkins, a woman in her 50s whose genuine love for education radiated from every interaction. She led them through hallways where student artwork created a kaleidoscope of creativity, past a library where children sat cross-legged listening to a volunteer read stories, and around corners where the sound of multiplication tables being recited echoed like a cheerful chant. The school felt alive with learning, every classroom door propped open to reveal scenes of academic engagement that would make any parent proud. Teachers paused their lessons to wave at Kane and Ranger, their students pressing faces against windows to catch glimpses of the police dog whose reputation had preceded him through excited whispers and playground rumors. Miss Langston's classroom was their final stop, and as they approached room 112, Kane noticed his partner's behavior beginning to shift in ways so subtle that someone less experienced might have missed them entirely. Ranger's tail, which had been wagging with anticipation, gradually lowered to a neutral position. His ears, previously relaxed and mobile, became fixed and forward-facing. Most telling of all, his pace slowed slightly, and Kane felt the leash grow taut as the dog's natural curiosity seemed to be replaced by something that looked suspiciously like caution. Kane chalked it up to fatigue from their busy morning of presentations, but Ranger had never shown signs of weariness during community events that he typically found energizing. Miss Langston stood in her doorway like a vision of educational perfection, her red cardigan complementing auburn hair that was styled in a way that suggested both professionalism and approachability. Her smile reached her eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that spoke of someone who found genuine joy in her work. Behind her, the classroom gleamed with the kind of organization that made parents feel confident their children were receiving quality instruction. Bulletin boards displayed student work with encouraging comments written in her neat handwriting, while reading corners had been arranged to create cozy spaces where young minds could explore literary worlds. The smell of apple-scented hand sanitizer, mixed with the faint aroma of markers and construction paper, creating an olfactory signature that had become synonymous with elementary education. 22 second graders sat at desks arranged in perfect rows, their faces turned toward the door with expressions of barely contained excitement that made Kane smile despite his partner's unusual behavior. The moment Ranger's paws crossed the threshold into Miss Langston's classroom, the atmosphere shifted with the subtlety of a storm gathering on a distant horizon. Kane felt it first through the leash, a tension that traveled up the leather strap like an electrical current, but what he saw in his partner's posture made his blood run cold. Ranger's entire body. Language transformed from the relaxed confidence of a veteran working dog to the coiled alertness of a predator, sensing imminent danger. His hackles didn't just rise. They stood at attention like soldiers responding to a battle cry, creating a ridge of fur along his spine that made him appear larger, more formidable, more dangerous than the children had ever imagined possible. The German shepherd's breathing changed, becoming shallow and controlled, his nostrils flaring as he processed scents that his human partner couldn't detect, but that apparently carried information so alarming it triggered every instinct honed through years of training. Kane watched in stunned silence as Ranger's ears pinned back against his skull, a position the dog adopted only when confronting genuine threats, and his brown eyes locked onto Miss Langston with an intensity that seemed to bore through her cheerful facade like a laser cutting through paper. The first bark erupted without warning, a sound so sharp and aggressive that several children recoiled in their seats as if struck by lightning. This wasn't the controlled bark Ranger used during training exercises or the playful sound he made when excited about a game. This was the bark of a warrior identifying an enemy, raw and primal and filled with a violence that made the air itself seem to vibrate with danger. Miss Langston's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but in that brief moment, Kane caught a glimpse of something that made his skin crawl. Behind her warm brown eyes, something cold and calculating flickered like a snake moving through tall grass, there and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. She recovered her composure with the skill of someone accustomed to maintaining facades, raising her hands in a gesture that appeared both surrendering and calming, while speaking in the same gentle tone she used to comfort frightened children. But Ranger wasn't fooled by performances, and his response was immediate and terrifying. He lunged forward against the leash, his powerful muscles bunching as he strained toward Miss Langston with the single-minded determination of a missile seeking its target. Kane had to plant his feet and use all his strength to prevent the dog from reaching the woman who stood frozen at the front of her classroom, her face pale beneath carefully applied makeup. The children's excited chatter had died, as if someone had thrown a switch, replaced by a silence so complete that the only sounds were Ranger's continued growling and the soft whimper of a little girl in the front row who had begun to cry. Kane found himself caught between his training as a police officer, which told him to trust his partner's instincts completely, and his rational mind, which insisted that they were in an elementary school classroom surrounded by innocent children and a teacher whose background check had revealed nothing suspicious. But Ranger's behavior was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented in their 7 years together, and Kane knew with sickening certainty that his partner had detected something that human senses couldn't perceive, something that posed a threat so serious it had triggered every alarm in the dog's highly trained nervous system. As he struggled to maintain control of the situation, Kane's eyes swept the classroom, taking in details that his police training had taught him to notice. The perfectly organized desk that seemed almost too neat, the way Miss Langston's hands trembled slightly despite her calm voice, and most disturbing of all, the expression on little Lucy Parker's face as she sat in the back row clutching her backpack like a lifeline, her brown eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go far deeper than simple surprise at a dog's aggressive behavior. In the chaotic moments following Ranger's explosive reaction, Kane's trained eye caught something that made his stomach drop like a stone falling into an endless well. Lucy Parker, a quiet 7-year-old with mismatched socks and a purple hoodie that seemed too big for her small frame, wasn't looking at the snarling German shepherd with the same mixture of fear and fascination that filled her classmates' faces. Instead, her brown eyes were fixed on Miss Langston with an expression that spoke of secrets too heavy for such young shoulders to bear, a recognition that suggested this wasn't the first time she had seen her teacher's mask slip. The child's knuckles had turned white from gripping her backpack straps, and Kane noticed that she was holding the bag protectively against her chest as if it contained something precious or dangerous that she couldn't let go. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, the kind of hyperventilation that accompanies panic attacks, and when Miss Langston's gaze swept across the classroom in an attempt to regain control of the situation, Lucy actually flinched, pressing herself deeper into her chair as if trying to disappear entirely. Kane had seen that look before, in the eyes of abuse victims who had learned to read danger in the slightest changes in their tormentor's expression, and the sight of it in a second grader's face filled him with a cold rage that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. The classroom felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode, with Ranger's continued growling providing a soundtrack of menace that seemed to strip away the cheerful veneer and reveal something rotten underneath. Miss Langston was speaking in soothing tones, trying to calm the frightened children while suggesting that perhaps the dog was simply having an off day, but her words sounded hollow and rehearsed, like lines from a script she had memorized for just such an occasion. Kane noticed that she kept glancing toward the door, as if calculating her chances of escape, and when she moved slightly to position herself closer to the exit, Ranger's growling intensified to a level that made the windows rattle. The other children were beginning to cry now, their innocent minds unable to process what they were witnessing, but Lucy remained frozen in place, her eyes darting between the dog and her teacher with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading every subtle signal in the environment. Kane made a decision that would later prove to be life-saving, choosing to trust his partner's instincts over social conventions and polite assumptions about the safety of educational environments. He keyed his radio with his free hand, never taking his eyes off Miss Langston as he called for backup, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid fire. The request for additional units to respond to Woodridge Elementary sent ripples through the dispatch center, because Kane was known for his calm professionalism and had never before called for backup during a routine community outreach event. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Miss Langston's facade finally began to crack completely, her carefully constructed persona crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. She took a step toward the door, but Ranger was ready, positioning himself between her and the exit with the tactical precision of a soldier who understood that his mission was to protect the innocent at all costs. The German shepherd's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that gleamed like ivory daggers, and the sound that emerged from his throat was less bark than battle cry, a declaration of war against whatever evil he had detected, lurking beneath the surface of what should have been a sanctuary of learning. Kane could hear his backup approaching, their vehicle's engines growing louder with each passing second, but in that moment suspended between revelation and action, he found himself staring into Lucy Parker's terrified eyes and seeing a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones we invite into our children's lives with open arms and grateful hearts. The next day arrived with deceptive normalcy, autumn sunlight streaming through classroom windows as if nothing had changed. But Kane returned to Woodridge Elementary with Ranger at his side and a growing certainty that their initial encounter had been just the beginning of something far more sinister. Principal Atkins had insisted that the previous day's incident was an anomaly, suggesting that perhaps Ranger had been overwhelmed by the excitement of career day, but Kane's years of experience had taught him to trust his partner's instincts over human rationalization. They entered Miss Langston's classroom under the pretense of a follow-up demonstration, giving Kane the opportunity to observe both the teacher and her students in a more controlled environment. Miss Langston greeted them with her trademark warmth, but Kane noticed subtle changes in her demeanor, the way her hands fluttered nervously when she spoke, how her eyes darted toward the windows as if planning escape routes, and most telling of all, the forced quality of her smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The children seemed subdued, their usual enthusiasm dampened by memories of the previous day's chaos, but Lucy Parker appeared genuinely terrified, her small frame trembling as she clutched her backpack with the desperation of someone holding onto their last lifeline. Ranger entered the room with professional focus, his senses immediately engaging as he processed the various scents that filled the space, but this time his reaction was different, more controlled but no less intense. Instead of immediately fixating on Miss Langston, the German shepherd began a systematic search of the classroom, his nose working methodically as he investigated desks, corners, and storage areas with the thoroughness of a detective examining a crime scene. Kane watched his partner's behavior with growing tension, noting how Ranger's tail remained rigid and his ears stayed pinned forward in a position that indicated he was tracking something specific. The dog moved with purpose through the classroom until he reached Lucy's desk in the back row, where he suddenly froze, his entire body going rigid as his nostrils flared to process whatever scent had captured his attention. Ranger's head turned toward Lucy's backpack with mechanical precision, and when he took a step closer to investigate, the little girl's face went white as snow, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow as panic threatened to overwhelm her small frame. Kane approached slowly, his training kicking in as he recognized the signs of a child in extreme distress, but when he gently asked Lucy if he could examine her backpack, Miss Langston's reaction confirmed his worst suspicions. The teacher moved quickly toward them, her voice taking on an edge of desperation as she insisted that there was no need to frighten the child further, but Ranger positioned himself between Miss Langston and Lucy with the protective instincts of a guardian angel. Kane knelt beside Lucy's desk, his voice soft and reassuring, as he explained that she wasn't in trouble and that he just needed to make sure she was safe, but the terror in her eyes spoke of secrets that had been tearing at her soul for weeks or months. When Lucy finally nodded her permission and handed over her backpack with trembling hands, Kane felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he carefully opened the small pink bag that should have contained nothing more threatening than pencils and homework assignments. At first glance, everything appeared normal. A Hello Kitty folder, a worn notebook, a pencil case decorated with unicorns, but Ranger's continued agitation told Kane to look deeper, to search beyond the innocent facade that masked something deadly. His fingers found a hidden compartment in the lining of the backpack, and what he discovered there made his blood turn to ice in his veins. A used syringe cap, small and innocuous but completely out of place in a 7-year-old school supplies, lay next to a cloth strip that carried the sweet, artificial scent of chloroform, chemicals that had no business existing in an elementary school classroom, but that told a story of predation and planned violence that made Kane's hands shake with suppressed rage. The discovery of the syringe cap and chloroform-soaked cloth in Lucy's backpack created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by the sound of Ranger's low growling and the soft whimper that escaped from Lucy's throat as she realized her terrible secret had finally been exposed. Kane held the evidence in his gloved hands, feeling the weight of not just the physical objects, but the implications they carried, the story they told of innocence corrupted and trust violated in ways that made his soul ache with fury and heartbreak. Miss Langston's carefully constructed facade shattered, completely in that instant, her face draining of color as she backed toward the classroom door like a cornered animal seeking escape. But Ranger was ready for her movement, positioning himself between the teacher and the exit with the tactical precision of a warrior who understood that his mission was to protect the innocent at all costs. The other children in the classroom sensed the shift in atmosphere, even if they couldn't understand its significance, their young faces reflecting confusion and fear as they watched their trusted teacher transform before their eyes into someone they no longer recognized. Kane's training took over as he carefully secured the evidence while keeping one eye on Miss Langston and another on Lucy, whose small frame was shaking so violently it seemed as if she might collapse at any moment. When he gently asked Lucy who had given her these items, her response came in a whisper so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her words, but what she said confirmed his worst fears and filled him with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. She told him that Miss Langston had given her the items weeks ago, explaining that they were special supplies that Lucy needed to carry with her at all times, but more disturbing was the threat that had accompanied the gift. If Lucy ever lost the items or told anyone about them, something terrible would happen to her mother. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as it was evil, using a child's love for her parent as a weapon to ensure silence and compliance, turning Lucy into an unwilling accomplice in her own potential destruction. Kane could see the relief flooding through the little girl's features as she finally spoke the truth she had been carrying like a poison in her heart, but he could also see the terror that accompanied that relief, the fear that her confession might somehow put her mother in danger. Miss Langston made a desperate attempt to maintain her innocence, insisting that there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that she would never harm a child, but her words rang hollow in the face of the physical evidence and Lucy's testimony. Kane keyed his radio again, calling for immediate backup and requesting that Detective Moran respond to the scene, because he knew that what they had uncovered was just the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than anyone had imagined. As sirens wailed in the distance and the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air, Kane found himself looking into Lucy's brown eyes and seeing not just a victim, but a survivor, a little girl whose courage in finally speaking the truth had potentially saved not only her own life, but the lives of other children who might have fallen prey to Miss Langston's predatory schemes. The classroom that had once been a sanctuary of learning had been revealed as a hunting ground, where evil wore the mask of education. But thanks to Ranger's incredible instincts and Lucy's eventual bravery, the monster hiding in plain sight was finally about to be exposed for what she truly was. Ranger remained alert and protective, his body language communicating to everyone present that he would not allow Miss Langston to escape or to harm any of the children under his protection, and in that moment Kane felt a surge of pride and gratitude for his four-legged partner, whose supernatural ability to detect danger had prevented a tragedy that could have destroyed multiple families and shattered a community's faith in the institutions they trusted most. The arrest of Miss Clara Langston sent shockwaves through Woodridge Elementary and the surrounding community, but for Kane and Detective Moran, it marked the beginning of an investigation that would reveal horrors beyond anything they had initially imagined. As Langston was processed at the county sheriff's office, her fingerprints told a story that made seasoned law enforcement officers question everything they thought they knew about background checks and institutional safety. The woman who had spent 6 months earning the trust and love of second graders, who had volunteered for extra duties and stayed late to help struggling students, was not Clara Langston at all, but rather Natalie Graves, a suspect in multiple child trafficking cases across Nevada, Oregon, and New Mexico, who had vanished without a trace just as federal warrants were being issued for her arrest. The discovery of her true identity opened floodgates of information that painted a picture of a sophisticated predator who had perfected the art of infiltrating educational systems through forged credentials, manufactured references, and an uncanny ability to present herself as the ideal educator that desperate school districts were eager to hire. Moran spread Natalie's file across the conference table like a roadmap to hell, each document revealing another layer of deception that had allowed this monster to operate in plain sight for years while law enforcement agencies across multiple states searched for a ghost. The forged teaching license from Arizona was a masterpiece of criminal craftsmanship, complete with authentic-looking seals and signatures that had fooled even experienced administrators who thought they were conducting thorough verification processes. Her manufactured employment history included glowing recommendations from schools that existed only on paper, references from supervisors who were actually accomplices in her trafficking network, and a carefully constructed narrative of a dedicated educator whose military husband's frequent relocations explained any gaps in her employment record. Kane studied photographs taken at various schools where Natalie had worked under different identities, seeing the same warm smile and maternal demeanor that had fooled parents, administrators, and children at Woodridge Elementary. But now that facade looked sinister and calculated, a predator's camouflage, that had been refined through years of practice. Detective Moran explained that Natalie's method of operation followed a consistent pattern that made Kane's blood run cold as he realized how close they had come to losing Lucy forever. She would arrive in a new community during times of staffing shortages, when desperate administrators were grateful for any qualified applicant who could fill empty classrooms and ease overcrowding. Her credentials always appeared flawless because she had invested years in building false identities that could withstand casual scrutiny, creating layers of deception so deep that only federal-level background investigations would have uncovered the truth. Once embedded in a school system, Natalie would spend months identifying vulnerable children who fit specific criteria that made them ideal targets for trafficking operations. Students from single-parent homes, children whose parents worked multiple jobs and had limited time for involvement in their education, kids who displayed signs of emotional isolation or family dysfunction that made them easier to manipulate. The psychological manipulation tactics she employed were sophisticated beyond anything Kane had encountered in his years of law enforcement, involving a gradual process of building trust and dependency while simultaneously introducing fear-based control mechanisms that ensured her victims would remain silent, even when opportunities for rescue presented themselves. Lucy had been the perfect target in Natalie's twisted calculus, a bright, quiet child whose mother worked long hours at the pharmacy to support them both after a difficult divorce, whose father was largely absent from her life, and whose natural shyness made her less likely to confide in other adults about the special supplies her teacher had asked her to carry. The chloroform-soaked cloth and syringe cap were more than just tools of abduction. They were psychological weapons designed to condition Lucy for compliance, teaching her that she was responsible for carrying the instruments of her own potential destruction, while being told that any deviation from Natalie's instructions would result in harm to the person she loved most. Kane realized that Ranger's aggressive reaction to Natalie hadn't just been about detecting chemical residues or unusual scents, but rather the dog's incredible ability to sense the predatory energy that surrounded someone who had dedicated her life to hunting children. The interrogation of Natalie Graves under her true identity opened doorways into a criminal network so vast and sophisticated that it required federal intervention and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies across several states. Detective Moran led the questioning with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every detail extracted from this predator could potentially save other children who remained in danger, while Kane observed from behind one-way glass with Ranger at his side, the German Shepherd remaining alert even in the safety of the police station, as if he understood that the threat extended far beyond the woman now sitting in handcuffs. Natalie's initial attempts to maintain her innocence crumbled under the weight of physical evidence and Lucy's testimony, but what emerged during her eventual confession revealed a trafficking operation that operated with the efficiency of a legitimate business organization, complete with recruitment, specialists, document forgers, transportation coordinators, and safe houses scattered across the country where kidnapped children disappeared into a nightmare world that most people couldn't even imagine. The network's sophistication became apparent as Natalie described how she was recruited through encrypted communications and assigned specific geographical territories where she would establish false identities and infiltrate school systems to identify and groom potential victims. Her handlers provided her with meticulously crafted background documents, complete with references from other network members who posed as former supervisors and colleagues, creating layers of verification that could fool even experienced administrators who believed they were conducting thorough hiring processes. The selection criteria for targets were chillingly specific. Girls between the ages of 7 and 10 from broken or stressed family situations, children whose disappearance might be initially attributed to custody disputes or runaways, victims whose parents lacked the resources or social connections to generate significant media attention or law enforcement pressure. Natalie revealed that Lucy had been earmarked for abduction during the upcoming spring break when her mother would be working overtime shifts at the pharmacy, leaving the child alone for extended periods that would provide the perfect opportunity for a kidnapping disguised as a family emergency or medical situation. The way chloroform and syringe weren't intended for immediate use, but rather served as psychological conditioning tools that would make Lucy compliant when the actual abduction took place, teaching her that resistance was futile and that her survival depended on following instructions without question. The trafficking network operated through a series of coded communications that used educational terminology to disguise their true purpose, with discussions of curriculum development actually referring to victim selection, parent-teacher conferences serving as code for delivery schedules, and field trips representing transportation to regional distribution hubs where children would be processed before being moved to their final destinations. Natalie's confession revealed that she was one of dozens of operatives working under the direction of a woman known only as Miss Dana, whose southern accent and honey-sweet voice masked the heart of someone who had turned child trafficking into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that spanned the entire southeastern United States. The network's reach extended into legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering and transportation, including a chain of private tutoring centers that actually functioned as temporary holding facilities, and a fleet of vehicles disguised as school transportation services that moved victims between locations without attracting suspicion from law enforcement or concerned citizens. Kane felt physically ill as he listened to Natalie describe the methodical destruction of childhood innocence as if she were discussing lesson plans or homework assignments, her clinical detachment from the suffering she had caused revealing a level of psychological damage that made her more monster than human. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents traced financial records and communication patterns that led to safe houses in Colorado, Nevada, and Texas, each raid revealing more victims and more evidence of a criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years, while law enforcement agencies struggled to connect seemingly unrelated disappearances across multiple jurisdictions. The revelation that Natalie Graves was merely a cog in a vast criminal machine led Kane and federal investigators on a desperate hunt for the shadowy figure known only as Miss Dana, whose honey-sweet southern accent masked the operational heart of a trafficking network that had been destroying children's lives across multiple states for over 5 years. Agent Porter arrived from the FBI's Dallas field office with a task force that transformed the small county sheriff's office into a war room, walls covered with maps, photographs, and communication intercepts that painted a picture of a criminal enterprise so sophisticated it rivaled international drug cartels in its organizational structure and reach. The intercepted phone call that mentioned Ranger by name had sent chills through every law enforcement officer involved in the case, because it meant that Miss Dana not only knew about their investigation, but was actively monitoring their progress and adapting her operations to avoid capture. The audio analysis revealed subtle regional dialect markers that suggested Miss Dana had spent significant time in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, but her carefully controlled speech patterns indicated education and intelligence that made her far more dangerous than the typical criminal they were accustomed to pursuing. Kane studied the map where red pins marked confirmed locations where network operatives had been active, seeing a pattern that stretched from Texas to Virginia and realizing that they were dealing with someone who understood logistics, security, and human psychology with the expertise of a military strategist. The breakthrough came when communications intercepts revealed that Miss Dana was planning to abandon her current operational base and establish new territories in response to the exposure of Natalie's activities, but her arrogance led her to use a burner phone that federal technicians were able to trace to cell towers near a small town called Marion Hills, Kentucky. The town fit the network's preferred operational profile perfectly: rural, isolated, economically depressed, with limited law enforcement resources and a population that minded its own business, making it an ideal location for someone who needed to disappear while maintaining access to potential victims. Kane and Ranger joined the federal task force convoy that descended on Marion Hills like an occupying army, their vehicles stirring dust clouds on back roads that probably hadn't seen that much traffic since the last county fair. But the urgency driving their mission made every mile feel like an eternity, because they knew that Miss Dana's awareness of their investigation meant she would be eliminating evidence and potentially silencing witnesses who could testify against her organization. The town's only school sat at the intersection of two highways, a brick building that looked like it had been constructed during the Eisenhower administration and maintained through a combination of federal grants and community fundraising efforts that never quite covered all the necessary repairs. Sheriff Dean Metcalf met them at the school with the kind of suspicious cooperation that small-town law enforcement displayed when federal agents invaded their jurisdiction. But his attitude changed when Kane explained that they were hunting a child predator who might be operating within his community's most trusted institution. Ranger's behavior during their initial reconnaissance told Kane everything he needed to know about the threat level they were facing. The German Shepherd's body language shifting into the hyper-alert posture that indicated he was processing scents and stimuli that suggested imminent danger. As they approached the school's administrative offices, Ranger's nose began working overtime, his nostrils flaring as he detected chemical signatures that had become associated with the trafficking network's operations, including the distinctive combination of chloroform, industrial cleaning agents, and something else that Kane couldn't identify but that made his partner increasingly agitated. The moment they entered the speech therapy office and encountered the woman calling herself Miss Darla, Ranger's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, his growl rumbling through the small room like thunder, announcing an approaching storm, while his eyes locked onto the elderly woman with the kind of intensity that meant he had found exactly what they were looking for. Kane felt his adrenaline surge as he realized that their hunt was about to end, but he also knew that cornering a predator of Miss Dana's caliber meant they were entering the most dangerous phase of their investigation. The woman sitting behind the desk in the speech therapy office at Marion Hills Elementary possessed the kind of grandmotherly appearance that made parents instinctively trust her with their children, but Ranger's volcanic reaction told Kane that they were finally face-to-face with the architect of unspeakable evil, who had been orchestrating child trafficking operations across the southeastern United States for over half a decade. Miss Darla's silver curls and wire-rimmed glasses created a perfect disguise for someone whose honey-sweet voice had been captured on federal wiretaps, directing the systematic destruction of childhood innocence. But the German Shepherd's supernatural ability to detect predatory energy meant that no amount of cosmetic camouflage could fool his highly trained senses. Kane felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he studied the woman's office, noting details that his police training had taught him to recognize as potential evidence, educational certificates that looked authentic but bore the names of institutions he suspected didn't exist, children's folders containing photographs and personal information that seemed excessive for legitimate speech therapy services, and most disturbing of all, a bookshelf that included titles about childhood development alongside volumes that dealt with psychological manipulation and trauma bonding techniques. The moment Kane asked about her previous employment history, he watched Miss Darla's mask begin to slip in ways so subtle that someone without law enforcement training might have missed them entirely. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hands moved protectively toward her desk drawer, and most telling of all, the barely perceptible change in her breathing pattern that indicated someone preparing for fight-or-flight responses. Ranger's continued growling filled the small office with menace that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves, and when Miss Darla reached toward her desk drawer with movements that suggested she was accessing something more dangerous than office supplies, Kane drew his sidearm with the lightning reflexes of someone whose survival had depended on reading threatening situations correctly. The discovery of burner phones and detailed files containing photographs, addresses, and psychological profiles of local children confirmed Kane's worst fears about what they had uncovered, but it was the folder labeled with Maya Gibson's name that made his blood run cold, because it contained the kind of detailed personal information that could only have been gathered through weeks or months of careful surveillance and planning. Maya's file revealed the same targeting criteria that had made Lucy Parker attractive to Natalie Graves, a vulnerable 8-year-old living with her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident, a child whose emotional isolation and family circumstances made her an ideal candidate for predators who understood that traumatized children were easier to manipulate and less likely to be believed if they tried to report abuse. The meticulous planning evident in Maya's file spoke to a level of criminal sophistication that made Kane realize they were dealing with someone who approached child trafficking with the methodical precision of a military operation, analyzing potential victims like a general studying enemy positions before launching an attack. Miss Darla's surrender came not with dramatic resistance, but with the quiet resignation of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around her, her hands raised in defeat, while her eyes remained cold and calculating as if she was already planning her next move or considering which of her associates she might sacrifice to reduce her own legal exposure. The arrest of Dana Winslow, whose real name emerged during fingerprint analysis, represented the culmination of a federal investigation that had consumed thousands of hours and millions of dollars while trying to dismantle a criminal network that had operated with virtual impunity for years by exploiting the trust that communities placed in educational institutions. Kane felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion as he watched federal agents place handcuffs on the woman whose voice had been haunting law enforcement recordings for years, but he also knew that their success in capturing Miss Dana was just the beginning of a legal process that would require testimony from traumatized children and cooperation from victims, who had been conditioned to fear the very authorities who were trying to help them. Ranger remained alert throughout the arrest process, his body language communicating that he understood the significance of what had just occurred, while maintaining the protective posture that had saved so many lives throughout this investigation. The arrest of Dana Winslow triggered a cascade of revelations that exposed the true scope of her trafficking network's reach, as federal investigators worked around the clock to identify and rescue children who had been targeted by operatives working under her direction across multiple states. Kane found himself at the center of a massive victim recovery operation that required delicate coordination between law enforcement agencies, child protective services, and mental health professionals who specialized in treating trauma survivors whose trust in authority figures had been systematically destroyed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. 13 safe houses that federal agents raided in Colorado, Nevada, and Texas yielded evidence of horrors that made seasoned investigators struggle to maintain their professional composure, including detailed records of children who had been processed through the network's distribution system like inventory in a warehouse, their identities reduced to code numbers and physical descriptions that stripped away every trace of their humanity. Maya Gibson's rescue from what appeared to be a routine grandmother's house but was actually a temporary holding facility revealed the network's sophisticated use of legitimate-appearing family structures to hide their criminal activities, with elderly accomplices who presented themselves as loving caregivers while actually serving as guards and psychological conditioners who prepared children for transport to their final destinations. Kane accompanied Maya during her initial interviews with federal agents and child psychologists, watching as the 8-year-old struggled to distinguish between the lies she had been told and the reality of her situation, her small voice barely audible as she described weeks of being told that her real grandmother was dead and that she would never see home again unless she followed orders without question. The psychological damage inflicted on Maya and other recovered victims extended far beyond the immediate trauma of kidnapping, encompassing systematic destruction of their ability to trust adults, believe in their own worth, or maintain hope that rescue was possible, conditioning that had been designed to create compliant victims who would not attempt escape or resist their captors' demands. Kane realized that Ranger's incredible ability to detect predatory energy had prevented Lucy from experiencing the same psychological torture that had been inflicted on children who weren't fortunate enough to have a highly trained police dog protecting their school. But he also understood that the Trauma of carrying instruments of her own potential destruction had left scars that would require years of therapy to heal. The investigation revealed that Dana's network had been operating with near impunity for so long because they exploited systemic weaknesses in background check procedures, communication between law enforcement agencies, and the natural tendency of communities to trust educational institutions without conducting the kind of deep verification that would have exposed their operatives' false identities. Federal agents discovered that the network maintained detailed psychological profiles of law enforcement officers and administrators in their target communities, allowing them to anticipate investigation patterns and modify their operations to avoid detection, while continuing to identify and groom potential victims with scientific precision. The children who had been rescued from various network facilities displayed a heartbreaking range of trauma responses that reflected the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques Dana's organization had perfected over years of operation, from catatonic withdrawal to aggressive acting out to desperate attempts to please authority figures in hopes of avoiding further punishment. Kane spent hours reviewing case files that documented the network's victims, seeing photographs of children whose eyes reflected a loss of innocence so profound it made him question his faith in humanity's capacity for redemption. But he also saw evidence of resilience that reminded him why his work mattered and why Ranger's instincts had been so crucial in preventing additional tragedies. The recovery operation expanded internationally when federal investigators discovered that Dana's network had connections to trafficking organizations in Mexico and Central America, creating a pipeline that moved American children south while bringing foreign victims north in a criminal exchange system that maximized profits while minimizing the risk of detection by authorities who were focused on domestic cases. Kane participated in victim identification sessions where recovered children viewed photographs of network operatives, watching as traumatized survivors pointed to images of people they remembered as teachers, counselors, and other trusted figures who had betrayed their innocence in pursuit of profit, their testimony providing crucial evidence for prosecutions that would span multiple jurisdictions and require years to complete. The success of Kane and Ranger's investigation into the trafficking network operating through American schools sparked a nationwide reassessment of K-9 units' potential contributions to child protection efforts, leading to the development of specialized training programs that focused on detecting the unique chemical and behavioral signatures associated with predatory activities in educational environments. Kane found himself traveling across the country as a consultant and trainer, sharing the techniques that had made Ranger so effective at identifying threats that human senses couldn't perceive, but more importantly, he helped other handlers understand the importance of trusting their partner's instincts, even when those instincts contradicted conventional wisdom about institutional safety. The federal government allocated millions of dollars to expand K-9 programs specifically focused on child protection, recruiting dogs with the exceptional scenting abilities and temperament stability required for work in sensitive environments where false positives could destroy innocent lives, while missed detections could result in continued victimization of vulnerable children. Ranger became something of a celebrity within law enforcement circles, his photograph displayed in training facilities across the country, alongside case studies that demonstrated how properly trained police dogs could serve as early warning systems for predatory behavior that might otherwise go undetected. Until after children had been harmed, Kane received dozens of letters from other K-9 handlers describing similar incidents where their partners had displayed unusual aggression or agitation around individuals who were later discovered to be involved in criminal activities targeting children, suggesting that Ranger's abilities were not unique, but rather represented an underutilized resource that could save countless lives if properly recognized and acted upon. The training programs that emerged from Ranger's success story emphasized the importance of handler education about recognizing and interpreting their dog's behavioral signals, because even the most talented K-9 was only as effective as the human partner who understood how to read and respond to their communications about potential threats. Detective Moran established a database that tracked incidents where police dogs had exhibited unexplained aggressive reactions to individuals who were later found to be involved in crimes against children. Discovering patterns that suggested K-9 intuition about predatory behavior was far more common than anyone had previously realized, but had been dismissed as coincidence or poor training. The psychological profiles developed by federal investigators revealed that child predators often carried distinctive chemical signatures related to the stress hormones, medications, and other substances associated with their criminal activities, creating scent markers that trained dogs could detect even when human investigators found no obvious signs of suspicious behavior. Kane participated in research studies that examined the neurological basis for dogs' ability to detect predatory intentions, working with scientists who believed that canine brains processed olfactory information in ways that allowed them to identify emotional and psychological states that remained invisible to human observation. The success stories began accumulating as more canine units received specialized training in child protection techniques, with handlers reporting incidents where their dogs had identified threats in schools, recreational facilities, and other environments where children gathered, leading to arrests and rescues that might never have occurred without four-legged early warning systems. Kane established a foundation dedicated to training police dogs and their handlers in child protection techniques, using donations from grateful families and communities to fund programs that put specialized canine teams in school districts across America, creating a network of canine guardians whose presence served as both protection and deterrent for those who might consider targeting children. The Foundation's training protocols emphasized the importance of building relationships between canine teams and school communities, ensuring that children viewed police dogs as protectors rather than threats, while educating teachers and administrators about recognizing and reporting unusual canine behavior that might indicate hidden dangers. Kane's speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences always included Ranger, who had become an ambassador for the life-saving potential of human-canine partnerships when those partnerships were built on mutual trust, proper training, and unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would exploit society's most vulnerable members. Years have passed since that autumn morning when Ranger's bark shattered the illusion of safety at Woodridge Elementary, but the echoes of his warning continue to reverberate through communities across America, where parents now understand that evil doesn't announce itself with warning signs or theatrical villainy, but instead arrives wearing the masks of those we trust most deeply. Kane retired from active duty 3 years after the trafficking network's dismantlement, but he and Ranger remain active in training programs that have revolutionized how law enforcement approaches child protection, their partnership serving as proof that sometimes salvation comes not from technology or bureaucracy, but from the ancient bond between humans and the animals who see truths we cannot perceive. Lucy Parker graduated from elementary school with honors and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Her trauma transformed into purpose as she dedicated herself to understanding the animals who had saved her life, but on quiet evenings, she still visits Kane and Ranger, bringing tennis balls and treats, while sharing stories about her academic achievements and future plans with the two heroes who gave her the chance to have a future at all. The federal prosecutions, resulting from the network investigation, led to convictions that sent Dana Winslow and her accomplices to federal prison for life without possibility of parole. But Kane knows that somewhere in America's heartland, other predators are studying those cases and adapting their methods to avoid detection, making the work of canine units more crucial than ever. Maya Gibson and the dozens of other children rescued from the trafficking network's facilities have begun the long journey of healing, supported by specialized therapy programs and surrounded by families who understand that recovery from such profound trauma requires patience, love, and the kind of unwavering commitment that Ranger displayed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The foundation Kane established has trained over 200 K9 teams in child protection techniques, creating a network of four-legged guardians whose presence in schools and community centers serves as both deterrent and early warning system for those who would harm society's most vulnerable members. But perhaps the most important lesson learned from Ranger's heroic instincts isn't about training dogs or improving background checks or strengthening institutional security protocols, but rather about the crucial importance of listening to warnings that come from sources we might dismiss as unreliable or irrelevant, because sometimes the voice of truth speaks through a bark rather than words, through instinct rather than intellect, through the heart rather than the mind. Kane often reflects on how close they came to losing Lucy and countless other children to a network that had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, exploiting society's trust in educational institutions while systematically destroying the innocence they were supposed to protect and nurture. The memorial garden planted at Woodridge Elementary in honor of Rangers' service blooms each spring with flowers chosen by students who understand that heroes come in many forms. But on winter nights when snow covers the bronze plaque that bears his name, Kane wonders if somewhere in the darkness, other children are waiting for their own four-legged savior to recognize danger that human eyes cannot see. The question that haunts him most isn't whether they stopped all the predators or saved every child, but whether we as a society have learned to trust the warnings that come from unexpected sources, to listen to the voices that speak without words, and to understand that sometimes the most profound truths are revealed not through investigation or analysis, but through the simple act of a loyal dog refusing to let evil pass unchallenged into the sanctuary where children should be safe to learn and grow and dream without fear. As Ranger enters his golden years, his muzzle now grey with age but his eyes still sharp with protective instinct, Kane knows that their partnership has changed more than just their own lives, but has created ripples that will continue spreading through communities for generations to come, because some lessons are too important to be forgotten and some warnings too crucial to be ignored, especially when they come from the hearts of those who love us enough to risk everything in defense of innocence. And you, have you ever witnessed any heroic animal act? Tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.